been said, my talk is more like an intermediary talk between Kenneth Williford's talk and Grégoire Sergent-Pertuis's talk, just to give you some background and motivation for this model that we call the PCM, the Projective Consciousness Model, insisting a little bit on multimodality, but we'll see why, and it will be, of course, limited given the amount of time that we have. So, oh no, that's not the right computer. So to begin with, we try to model consciousness in a manner that we can integrate, I would say, in model-based behavioral science. So we have some sort of background conception of us as autonomous agents, embodied agents of sort. And so we want to think about consciousness as something playing a sort of function or functions, plural, in the economy of the governance of a system. You know, in the old days, that was called cybernetics. And so basically, we want to think about consciousness, its phenomenology, and the function that phenomenology may have in this type of framework. And we kind of adopt provisorily a convenient framework called active inference, whereby, you know, it's very general. You have a system that has beliefs that can be also encoded as preferences or expectations about relations or events in the world, and that is trying to plan action because it's a situated system in order to, you know, satisfy preference or gain sensory evidence to reduce uncertainty. So it has some driving force behind that motivate these actions. And his anticipation may not be always good, or his preference or expectation not always be satisfied. So it's yields prediction error of some sort. That can be modeled as a free energy, but basically we don't have much stakes into the free energy principle framework in and of itself. We are more interested in what's going on at the level of the conscious processing machine, if we can call it that way. So, you know, we want to situate the problem in stochastic optimal control in the general sense of the term. And I'm not going to enter into the detail of free energy because we have no time, but we can talk about it. It's a functional. You want to minimize it, basically, if you want to, if it's related to prediction error, if you wish, or violation of expectations, which can be about preferences too. Oh no, that's not right. So once you start doing this type of modeling, you say, okay, at the core of that, well, maybe I should come back to, there is what we would call integrative cognition, perhaps consciousness, and that's, we want to figure out how that can fit in that whole framework and what that could be. And so once we enter into this type of modeling, we usually have to make a distinction between an internal space and an external space. It's me pushing the wrong button. And the external space could be, it's purely kind of a modeling. It's like when you make compartment distinction in cellular modeling between the internal and external compartment, but it's important. There is the idea that there is a real world. That's somewhat we can model and we can manipulate. And there is an agent that has an internal states that represent that real world in somehow under a represented world, a world model that is to be thought as an internal space. And in between you have sensorimotor relationships. So the whole question is, what is the representation space that integrates information and that plays into planning, into anticipation of the consequence of action? How could it be structured? How can we understand it in this type of framework? And is there a way of thinking about it consistently with the phenomenology or aspect of the phenomenology of consciousness along the way of what Kenneth Williford had been saying? I'm not going to enter into the details of what the theories of consciousness out there, but let's mention just a few aspects that we might want our model to account for. Something like a global workspace in which there is some form of phenomenologically expressed or manifested multimodal integration, perceptual features, Some monitoring of prediction error is in the, Stanislas Dehaene model. Now we integrate that as key in the process, and of uncertainties. You're going to have some sort of internal model of the world that is projected in certain manner in perception, but in imagination, some attentional processes, some planning mechanisms to relate, perception to action, and emotion as a way of labeling effectively planning. And it's situated, the whole problem comes from situated agents. It's dependent on the point of view and actual ability to infer space, either through perspective taking of oneself projected in the future or through the perspective we may attribute to other, is actually very important in these agents. And then you can generalize that to theory of mind to make inference about others' mental states. If you can imagine their perspectives and use that. And of course, all of that is a bit functionalist. And you have to think about how that could fit some sort of phenomenological description of subjective experience that would be consistent with those functions and with this type of problem. So you see, the approach we have is very practical, and it's basic science as we do it. It's very modest. We don't expect it to resolve a lot of metaphysical or ontological question. At this point, even though I'm a neuroscientist initially, it's totally neutral with respect to the brain. We're trying to understand and model with math, to some extent, phenomenology and how it can fit in this type of general agent modeling framework as, some sort of biological cybernetics. So what we do here is we take very literally some aspects of the phenomenology, choosing the invariant features that are the most obvious, perhaps, by integrating a geometric model of a subjective perspective as part of active inference. So remember, the global workspace, there is this idea that there is a medium of representation in which perception, imagination, emotion drives, so the motivation of action, aspect of social cognition, planning of action, all of that would be somewhat integrated in a common space. And additionally, this space has the characteristics of having a subjective perspective. So the way we think about the problem in this general setup of active inference is then to bring, okay, that fits a lot of what we could do with projective geometry in terms of modeling a subjective perspective. And we can inscribe that into an optimization process, a bit as described before. And we can discuss a bit about some of those details. Yeah. So, but in order to state that, you start from phenomenology. So what's the form and the action of what we could call the field of consciousness? And here we are going to focus on spatial cognition, or spatial the phenomenology of spatial consciousness. And we are going to argue that, we can say it's a subjective space in 3D. It's your internal space of representation. Of course, if you have a phantom limb, it's not your real harm. You can have a lot of hallucinations. It's in 3D. That's very important. We're not experiencing images in 2Ds, we are, but in a 3D space, it's in perspective. It's really have vanishing points. Parallel lines seems to converge at infinity, on an horizon at infinity. It doesn't, it's an old philosophical problem. It's underpinned by an evanescent and paradoxical point of view. It seems to be foundation of my egocentric frame. At the same time, it's not like another point in space. It's evasive. There is Kenneth Williford could talk a lot about that. And most of it, what is important here, we think about it as supramodal or multimodal. It has to fit the global workspace agenda. So it's a representation of space. When I close my eyes and I turn, I have some representation of space. We could say it's visual-like, or actually visual experiences like this representation of space. I'm blind, I touch things. I'm going to go back on that in more detail. I can infer a representation of space and have a sense that is all integrated in the same experience that can be consistent with sound. And we're going to come back to that. And the idea is that since it's also a space for planning, it's also a space for appraisal. So you have to have all those things together, somewhat linked through some mathematical principle to appraise, and control action in perception action loop, in imagination and planning, in social cognition and empathy. We are looking for a building block, something that would unify those things somehow with limitation, and that could make sense of this subjective perspective. I keep pushing the wrong button. So if you take these premises about the shape of the structure in 3D, it has to be somewhat, at least at some level of abstraction, a 3D projective space. The premises implies that if this space has a definite geometry, it has to be a 3D projective geometry, which entail the action of a group of transformation, the projective group, projective linear group, that is basically the set of rules for making a long story short, that will change any perspective in the internal space. Some of them are going to look like perspective I could take if I was going to move over there. Some of them may be quite different and bizarre, but the entire thing is regulated. Its ability to imagine or actually plan action and have a model of the consequences of its action by the action of this group on this type of geometry. And the internal space is structured like that because that is suggested to some extent, to a large extent, by the phenomenology. But what is important here, okay, is that the PCM at this point is not a model of visual awareness. When we present this model, because of the projective geometrical component, even though it's a 3D projective geometrical component, it's not just 2D on an image, people think immediately about the model of vision, naturally, because to some extent, vision is the sense modality through which a lot of the spatial cognition occur, in which, you have all the cues about parallax, about perspective cues, and the projection of the optic projection of the retina is kind of a 3D onto 2D projective operation that is on a projective plane. So, but vision is 3D, and it's more obvious in vision, but it's actually not just for vision. You have to think about it in a world full of ambiguity, where they have embodied constraints. For instance, we are situated. The context is going to matter. Affordances, for instance, can I do this or this action? Can I move? Oh, no, I cannot. There is this, but I can move this way. Affordances are going to matter. And those things are going to affect multisensory information. So, for instance, vision, of course, but audition too, for source localization, the sense of a space in a room, proprioception, the sense of my body in the space, vestibular sensing for the vertical, and accelerometry, so I can have a sense of my own motion, and interoception, the sense of my organs. All of that is spatial. The hypothesis is all of that is spatialized in a unified kind of spatial representation or global workspace. And the idea, this follows the rule of projective geometry. And the thing is that you have to translate that into action planning. If there is really a unity in terms of perception, action, and consciousness, somehow you want the things to be able to shape the experience from a certain perspective, from a certain standpoint, but you want it also to give you the rules of transformation that can help you to, what if I was going to move over there, for instance? So that's the overall idea, is that this is what this structure, this projective geometrical structure within a system of active inference is doing somewhat. So just to go further on the motivation of that space now from a psychophysical or cognitive science slash neuroscience standpoint. Number one, the visual space, the 3D visual space, I'm not talking about the retina, overall respect a perspectival structure that is quite consistent with projective geometry. It respects, when you do very sensorimotor task, I'm not going to enter into the detail, it respects Papus theorem, which is a key for projective geometry. It has a variety of violation of projective geometry in the details, but that's really the detail. The overall frame is projective. When you do pictorial relief, when you watch a picture, a postcard, a painting, a photography, even though it's on a 2D plane, it feels 3D, right? You have this kind of inverse problem solution where you extrude a 2D image into a 3D sort of perspective. And that actually follows projective transformation. We can explain that through projective transformation as part of the process of regularizing the inverse problem of projecting from 2D to 3D. We can explain also things like Ames rooms. There are several Ames rules, illusion. I'm not going to enter into the detail, but a wealth of illusions, visual illusion in that case. You're going to tell me, like the moon illusion, we can predict specifically what the moon is going to experience in terms of, as a function of elevation, it's going to go smaller when it's high in the sky and bigger when it is low on the horizon. With the model and developing the principle based on the constraint of the experimental situation, we can predict what is going to be the diameter of the moon that is going to be experienced as a function of a variety of priors. You can predict that, and then we can do virtual reality experiment and compare psychophysical function, how people actually gauge the relative size of the moon with respect to a target moon, and compare that to the simulation and find out that, well, there's quite a bit of a good fit, better than other model. Much work remains to be done. Again, it's, stepwise thing. And also it's important to understand it's not just visual, this structure. We need to integrate all this information into a common frame for coherence matter. And in the congenitally or early blinds, you have very advanced capabilities of spatial imagery and perspective taking. There are a few very interesting studies showing that how the congenitally or early blinds can actually, using spatial device, draw forms in 3D that are disposed on a board and that are, squares, cones, etc., and that they can touch them in an haptic manner. And then they have to imagine different perspectives and draw them with this machine. And they do fairly well. And also in orientation, in cities, putting yourself in the shoe of somebody else to know whether you should move on the right or on the left after touching a city, doing perspective taking, orienting with sound. There is a lot of reason to think that they have a similar way of integrating spatial information in spite of, some channel being critically impaired here. I'm not going to enter into that, but there are further more information. Cross-modal integration also is a sign that at least we tend to move this kind of internal spatial representation from different channels, like proprioceptive, for instance, into a visual-like frame. We want to describe it that way because vision science is being much more advanced than many other modality science. And so you see that, for instance, in the rubber hand illusion. You all know about the rubber hand illusion. You basically trick somebody to believe that his or her hand is brushed, but it's a rubber hand, the actual that you see being brushed by looking. Your actual hand has been moved. You don't see it because there is a screen. It's actually brushed. So you have the feeling of it being brushed, tactile, but you see the rubber hand being brushed. Visual is consistent. And then progressively, and you can test that in a variety of manner, you feel that your hand is actually located at the level of the rubber hand. So there is a shift in the spatial representation or the fitting of your proprioceptive skeleton, if you wish, into your virtual experience of space from kind of a referential that would be based on proprioception onto a visual one. And you see this kind of things on a variety of in a variety of experiments, like Olaf Blanke's and Thomas Metzinger works on full body illusion. A lot of that can be explained by the mechanics of the projective consciousness model. We can talk about that in further detail later. But what is really important is that we have this geometry that allows us to understand how we move from multiple frame of reference in a context-dependent manner. Depending on the context, you might want to have your frame of reference attached to the eyes, to the head, so independent of the eyes, to the shoulder. They can be egocentric, allocentric. The scope is very contextual also. Am I looking at you? We are having a discussion. Am I looking at the horizon? Am I planning a trip on a map? And so I have to take a perspective to understand the correspondence between the geographic map I have here with the space here. So all of that can be done very smoothly with projective geometry. So you have a space that is now generated by the action of a group. It's called a G-space. And Grégoire Sergent-Pertuis will talk much more about that. It's very important for stimulus location, orientation, bodily movement coordination, goal-directed actions, and perceptual stability. Also, if you have no way of stabilizing your experience of space, it would be difficult, and also to communicate it. So anyway, I'm going to stop here, even though I wanted to talk, but I'm going to introduce that just a little bit about how now we can think about the integration of all of it, perception, imagination, or if you wish, projective anticipation, motivation and action. You can use models, and Grégoire is going to talk that in some details among the different aspects of his talk, like POMDP, partially observable Markov decision process, in which you integrate group action in order to, for agents to anticipate the update of their a priori on, for instance, the location of an object. They have some uncertainty about it. They could either move and after action, update whether the object is really located there or there with some uncertainty function, or they can actually use the group that acts on information, not just on coordinate and the geometry itself, but forward and transform distribution of probability in space, so that in fact it creates a driving force to approach object in order to reduce uncertainty. The sheer fact that you have projective geometry compared to Euclidean geometry because of its effect on dilatation of information and contraction of information in the phenomenology is what here induces the drive, the epistemic drive to reduce uncertainty about, for instance, the localization of an object. And also depending on and Grégoire is going to talk about that in more detail, depending on the parameters of the projection of the projective geometrical transformation matrix. So basically, you can think about it like a focal, but in 3D in your space. The agents will start when they have to choose between different objects, and they project themselves to imagine what it would be like to be closer. I would gain more information. Depending on the parameter, if they are more or less focused in terms of, you can think about that as a small angle versus broad angle in photography, they will have different behavior of approach. Some will be hyper-focused on one object, and they will go there and they will look at it, and then only will go to the next one. And some, on the contrary, will go, oh, I'm going to look a bit at this one, I'm going to look a bit at this one, and other ones will, on the contrary, be completely swapping between objects as if they had ADHD. So this is just an effect of the projective parameter. So this is what we are trying to do. You see, it's painful, it's complicated, it's full of complicated concepts that we are trying to formalize. Maths become very difficult, simulation are heavy, and we can do things with robotics, but those who have a bit of knowledge about the projective consciousness model can know already about that. I think it's better that I stop now. To let Grégoire talks, to give you something more technical and more precise than the blah, 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 blah that I've been pushing out now. Yeah, so Grégoire, sorry. Oh yeah, if you have questions, of course, I can take questions.